Hello, everyone. My name is Prakash Muppirala. I run platform solutions at Fabric, and I've been with the company for about 9 months. Just quick overview of the company. Fabric is a modular and headless platform for modern e-commerce applications. Primarily, we're SaaS-based. Our focus is building actually functions for commerce platform through a set of interconnected components rather than prepackaged systems, so the retailers can actually scale commerce more efficiently across all their channels. Next slide. So in this session, I want to give you a quick context on the problem statement and why performance is critical to us, followed by key challenges. What are the challenges that are currently blockers for us to achieving the same? Followed by potential solutions, which are what are some options we're looking at to address these challenges, both manually, hybrid, autonomy, mix of all. And then lastly, the journey to autonomous and to our end-to-end experience and how we enable autonomy within our operating environment. Next slide, context. Yeah, next slide. So start with the context. As you've probably seen some of these numbers in the past history around e-commerce in general, either these are tied to the holiday event, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or even at peak seasons across, whether it's a retailer like Amazon, pure play retailer like Amazon, online traffic management like Akamai, retailer Walmart. This code that Amazon published in 2012, 100 milliseconds latency impacts close to a percentage of revenue gain. This is really important. Back then, it was probably relevant to Amazon and probably not others who are trying to catch up with online, but now it's table stakes. And with COVID, the shift to online and the growth in online over a period of time, this has become even more critical for us. Velocity, availability, scalability, performance are all equally important. Studies to the last decade, I mean, if you've seen through the evolution of commerce, the longer your site, your visitor comes to your site and waits, what we measure, something called bounce rate, is if you're waiting for a long time to have your page load, or you're spinning, probably we call this the circle of death, where you see this little circle moving around. That's when people bounce off your site. So it impacts your conversion, it impacts your brand, and it impacts revenue. So, and Amazon has set the standards for many retailers to come or in the future, and rapid site delivery when it comes to dynamic content, calling multiple services. I think most of the retailers, at least the top 20 retailers, are on some form of microservices or high available environment across channels. It's important to have that level of autonomy when you really think about how all these services come together. And online experience has drastically changed over the last decade. Amazon leading the way, obviously, setting the expectations for customer experience, navigation, pricing, shipping, everything else. I think as Amazon did that for themselves and all the merchants on their marketplace, every retailer really had to catch up and solve it. They have a solve for the business problem or the functional problem, but catching up with Amazon, who also is the leader on the cloud operating environment with AWS, it was extremely hard for retailers to do the same, to not just handle their functional and business problem, but also the operating and infrastructure problems as well. Next slide. So e-commerce, I think our customers primarily rely heavily on us, because this is really the secret sauce. This is really the bread and butter. Like they're powered through Fabric. Some of the key customers include McDonald's, GNC, Honest Company, NBF, and few others as well. And it's critical for us to make sure that they trust us in this environment for the scale. And as you probably heard in previous sessions as well, happy customers are critical to us. Every happy customers, as I saw it in the previous discussion as well, brings in 7 more. Next slide. So our current operating environment, we have more than 300 to 500 services delivering close to 10,000 if you look at all the customers combined, and our application code and various languages from Java, Python, Node.js. We predominantly serverless environment on AWS, but we have a hybrid infrastructure moving more towards ECS and EKS. Our latency or P90 is over 400 milliseconds right now. So next slide. So a little bit about the key challenges. Next slide. So the rapid growth over the last 24 months, we've seen as we're onboarding more customers onto our platform, some of the initial traces when we launched the full platform. As you probably know, in e-commerce, there's a natural navigation process as the customer experiences your website, from home page, search results page, to product detail page, cart, checkout, and post-transaction management. So when you look at the typical pattern on how the operating environment for something like that is set up, you have 80% of your traffic covering your top of the funnel, which is anywhere from home page all the way to your cart page, because there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of users, there's a lot of traffic as people are navigating different items, doing search results. But it's important to keep that very healthy. So 80% of traffic very healthy. The symptom and the pattern for this traffic is primarily on the top of the funnel is heavy read-only and a lot of access to the same set of data, which is product information, inventory, or pricing, or these kind of dominate your top of the funnel. When you look at the bottom of the funnel, it's critical to keep it highly performant, from shopping cart, checkout, post-transaction management, whether it's your order history or emails that get sent out. It's important to keep the performance at a very high level. And given the amount of traffic is very low, so the functionality, that if it's sitting on a Lambda, is just waiting on the next action to happen. So latency is very critical for the bottom of the funnel that impacts conversion. So when we launched some of our initial customers, we saw latency around the shopping cart and checkout performance, and the slowdown does impact conversion. So these were some of the initial observations when we launched for some of our few customers. On top of it, your post-transaction experience, which is from cart, checkout, and other, is an aggregation of a lot more microservices. Just taking the cart alone, you need service calls into your product information, pricing, inventory, customer, any other coupons or third-party services, loyalty management, which may or may not be hosted by your operating environment. These are calls out to vendors who are integrated into the platform. And then tax, payments, shipping, address verification, a lot more that are highly dependent on third party. So it's very important to orchestrate all of this in a highly performant way. Your shopping cart needs to be highly resilient and respond back within I think close to 500 milliseconds to 1 second. If you see that at Amazon, who has taken a step notch further ahead with one-click checkout on a product detail page is actually doing all of these actions and enabling that order behind the scenes. So now that's table stakes, right? That was there 12 to 15 years ago. Now, how do you bring the same thing, which every retailer is asking for, and managing that? Now, all the functional orchestration, when you look at all these services coming together and rendering your experience, is important to us as a company. But the operating part of it is where we need to make sure, is that really our core competence? We need to make sure that this can scale proportionally to our customers' needs and also our retailers' demands as well. Putting customer first in the zero tolerant operating model. Next slide. So when you look at how these services need to be optimized in real time across 10,000 services, so it's a trade-off between cost and latency. So you could always lit up all your services all the time across each customer and keep them running, but it has a direct impact on cost. So a balance between that is important. The second thing is on supply and demand. When you look at retail environment, it's always seasonal in nature. Whether it's back to school right now as we speak, to seasonal promotions by category, by merchant, to the big Q4, which is all about Black Friday, high volume, demand that happens over a short period of 4 to 6 weeks. And then lastly, it's enabling ensuring high availability and timeouts. Not all services can, even though you have a very strong operating environment, there's always going to be some form of timeouts and applications that are not in your control could degrade. So ability to gracefully degrade and still keep the functionality up and running. A good example of that is daily deals. When you look at something like daily deals, high velocity, high transaction, but then it's also important to make sure that the inventory is in stock for the customers to purchase. So having those scenarios mapped out well is actually equally important. Next slide. So just to zoom in, the optimize for latency versus cost, I think it's important to look at happy medium between keeping the latency very efficient at a reduced cost. So serverless costs, I think if you keep in our typical environment, if you keep a serverless environment for 24 hours, you're probably leveraging e-commerce. If you just look at the North American landscape, 12 to 15 hours a day. And the rest of the time, the traffic is minimal. If you look at the 12 to 15 hours of a typical day, that's when you generate close to 90% of any retailer's traffic. And it significantly degrades during the off hours. And if you're having serverless, balancing the cost against speed and optimizing for your high peak volume is equally critical for our customers. Next slide. And the last is matching supply to demand. When you really look at the variability in traffic, whether it's time of the day or season within the year, the high peak seasons that we have, avoiding the cold starts and having the capacity to handle that kind of volume, and more importantly, predicting what that volume could be and sizing to that is equally important. Supply to demand is very critical for e-commerce environments. Next slide. So what are potential solutions? So we mapped out several ideas in a matrix. As you look at the options for optimization, you could be 100% manual to semi-automated to third-party semi-automated, do it yourself, which is probably what most technology companies do, or at least start off their journey with. And lastly, autonomous. If that's your core competence, then you would go fully autonomous with the DIY. And you compare that with the velocity, safety, time to value, cost, focus on your core competencies, that's your core competency. And then lastly, supported platforms, right? Do you have that? So as you can see, as you shift from left to right, it's heavily indexed towards autonomy can actually bring in all of this together. So this is a natural progression for any of the startups, primarily in the technology space, to kind of evolve with what's start up with manual, automate to some extent, where you get to some kind of semi-automation, then you involve a third party to bring in some of the core capabilities and replace what you're done. And for something that you feel it's your secret sauce, then you actually build in those modules. And lastly, you go to autonomy if that's not your core competence. So we look at all combinations of these variables on the left against what we need to, how we need to progress in our operating environment. Next slide. So autonomy was always faster, better, and cheaper for things that is not our core competence. Primarily when you look at problem detection to recommended solution or recovery, and to validate the solution and finally launch in production. So so that was important to us. And you can see, all of this in a manual environment takes a lot of time. To semi-automated, you can bring in some savings. To autonomy, you really focused on your core competence or your real problem. Next slide. So our journey to autonomy, next slide. So last August, when we launched some of our first customers, and we saw latency reductions significantly across a few services that we enabled. Like I said, we didn't go full blown across all our operating environment, even for that one customer, but we picked the most important criteria, which is shopping cart conversion, where like we saw latencies from anything on the bottom of the funnel space, from shopping cart to checkout to all the navigation path that leads to creating an order. So 4 or 5 services that we wanted to kind of look at. And then when we turned that on, we saw a huge reduction in latency, and started thinking through what our next steps are. The email on the right kind of highlights our communication just around where we stood back then. Next slide. So if you look at the environment before, as you can see, the cold starts on and off before and after we turned on Sedai, we really optimized that environment around our Lambdas powering some of the core capabilities on the post-transaction management. Next slide. And quarter to quarter performance, as we march forward since over close to a year now, we kind of put in a lot more autonomous actions from moving from bottom of the funnel to covering the entire commerce environment across multiple retailers that we launched over a period of time. And we saw proportional latency reductions as well in days in terms of our ability to respond, recover, detect, and move forward as well. Next slide. So from a cost perspective, primarily on shopping cart, we could clearly say, this is a quote from one of my team members, primarily on shopping cart. When we saw this latency issues initially before we turned on Sedai, we saw it running really smooth. And obviously, significant reduction in latency improved our customer experience as well as our retailer satisfaction as well, with zero impact and potentially saving some costs on the cloud spend as well. Next slide. So then we started scaling up and down autonomously in production. Like I said, usually when you want to do this manually, it requires a lot of due diligence, both from talking to the retailer that we're doing this action, primarily if their search experience is down or if their checkout experience is slowing down, understanding the problem, having a communication, a bridge gets open, and you involve all the right stakeholders from your application domain teams. A lot of manual processes that need to get engaged, and primarily it is the latency, cost, and time. Right? If you look at all the three, but what the solution brings in is with autonomy, you bring in some of these detection, recovery, automation. In a 24/7 model, right? Really understanding the operating environment and bringing in efficiency around learning the system and automating the system to power better throughput and availability for our customers across all applications. Next slide. So, and we can prevent issues, primarily around timeouts ahead of time. And more importantly, what we also saw was, with this, there's a learning experience also, not just during your runtime environment, but as you deploy new code as well. It's important to kind of look at what the new code has done to the operating environment, quickly learning that, and also sharing feedback if there is any degradation across what was there before as well. So this continuous learning process is also equally important to us, apart from preventing issues as well. So I think some of this that we learned over a period of time, and the solution helped us through actually regressing some of these key things, key metrics that we wanted to focus on, and then bringing in learning back to our developers into making sure that future deployments, how does that change the operating environment, and then helping us grow through this over a period of time. Next slide. So back to what I just said, I think feedback loop critical to us, enabling strong confidence with our developers, as well as our DevOps and SRE team, into improving our release confidence, so we can innovate faster, focus on our core competencies, and build applications that can actually leave some of the commodity tasks to the autonomy environment, and then focus more on your core key problems. In our case, commerce services that can help our customers more from a functional perspective rather than the operating environment. Next slide. So generally speaking, over a period of time, we saw efficiency. We had 2 to 3 member team for our SRE. And then I see this more as a hybrid model. So a still a small number of people, but I think can actually handle a lot more customers as we saw this tremendous scale over the last 24 months. We still have a smaller team just handling the same operating environment, and the focus on our SRE team is more on the key application and the interconnectivity and orchestration rather than just on the compute and other things. We leave it to the experts, in this case, autonomy, to kind of manage that operations. Next slide. So a quick highlight on what happened last year. So as we onboarded Sedai, I think quick call, a pilot in 2 weeks, and then saw some autonomy actions in our sandbox and pre-prod environments. To when we got to production, as you saw, within 2 to 4 months, we were completely able to enable one of our customer end-to-end, starting from the post-transaction to the full e-commerce environment, followed by 100% coverage over other customers as well. Into more advanced, I think we're more than 10 plus accounts right now in production. Next slide. So our experience going autonomous, just to highlight on some of the key themes, we talked to latency reduction, which is very key to our operating environment and to our customers as well. Increase in increase the portfolio of customer you can actually serve by per SRE versus having a manual process involved, to autonomy helping us in a hybrid environment. And lastly, innovation, to kind of learn more both from the autonomy itself and learning more about our operating environment and improving an environment, as well as also helping our developers into helping through rollouts, both the developers as well as our DevOps engineers, into making the release process a lot more smoother. Next slide. Oh, that's it. So that's primarily how I want to kind of narrate a quick example on how we enable autonomy in our company and our environment over the past close to 12 months now. So I'm open for Q&A.
Great. Prakash, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. A couple of questions from folks here in the room. The first one is really on ROI. You've shown like several different advantages or benefits that you reaped from going autonomous. In terms of really hard ROI, what are the things that you have seen that have been a benefit, and what advice might you give on that, on sort of looking at the hard ROI for other folks here as well?
I think the most important benefit for us is to keep our customers happy. And when you take that back into what ROI means specifically to autonomy, I think it's when keeping our operating environment for our customers, they rely on Fabric to kind of power their entire business, right? E-commerce is primarily their livelihood. I think if it's a pure play online, it's 100% of the livelihood. If it's a retailer who has retail and online, it is definitely a significant portion of their livelihood. So keeping that operating environment high and alerting when issues happen, and more importantly, sizing to the seasonality that could come in, is a big ROI by itself. The next step is really about understanding our environment and optimizing our operating environment, and helping our SRE team focus more on our key applications versus the compute. Is another ROI which can be surfaced in terms of number of people and the ratio of customers to SRE engineer, the efficiency that you can bring in, both from customer satisfaction to the internal operating environment as well.
Great, got it. And yeah, we've got time. One more question here from the room as well. What do you really see as the role of the SRE? When there is an autonomous system also in place, you kind of you hinted a little bit on that, but how do you think the job of the SRE team changes?
It's important to kind of look at the SRE. There's always going to be playbooks. There's 100% autonomy, even in 100% autonomy in the world. In some of the previous sessions, we look at what happens when something goes wrong. Is the ability for SRE to really investigate, because e-commerce is complicated when it comes to orchestrating a lot of services. Our SREs are very functional in the domain knowledge as much as our engineers, And it's important to understand really the business problem and how to react quickly to the business problem versus focusing more on memory or the other aspects of operating environment. Is to really understand how to recover the business than recovering the operations itself, because we leave that to autonomy, and the SREs focus more on the business problems.
All right, got it. Fantastic. Well, Prakash, it was a really incredible story, and really appreciate a lot you taking the time to share with us today. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.